Today, I'm going to cover a bit of a slippery slope within martial arts, and that's forms. Why even forms? Because you have people on both ends of that spectrum. You've got people who are like, forms are the best thing since sliced bread and you should do them forever and always. And you've got people who believe forms are totally useless, just try to change my mind, you will fail. But what is their origin? Why do we even have forms? What's with forms and their whole deal entirely, and should they be done? I'm going to cover that slippery slope in today's knowledge drop with me, Greg Laurel. So, forms. Some people love that word. Some people are like, ugh, not again, whenever they hear forms. I've been on both ends of that. I mean, even just within where I currently train, I've been on both ends of yay forms and ugh forms, because why even do they exist? Sometimes I wonder, and sometimes I understand why they exist, sometimes I don't. And, like, I'll just get this out of the way. I think they have their place, and it really depends on what martial art you're doing that decides whether or not forms should even exist. For example, Krav Maga doesn't have forms. That just doesn't make even any sense as far as Krav Maga goes, because Krav Maga is strictly a combative art. There are no forms in Krav Maga. There are no forms in Jiu-Jitsu, obviously, because it's a ground-based art. A form in Jiu-Jitsu would just look like you writhing around on the ground in a very controlled manner for 2 minutes, and that would look silly, even if you did it perfectly. Even so, in traditional martial arts like, say, karate or wushu or taekwondo, you do have forms, and there are a few reasons for that. Now then, I personally only really know why karate has forms. This may also go to wushu and taekwondo, but I do not know for sure. So, the actual history is that when American forces occupied Japan and Okinawa in the Second World War, they started learning karate, and they started learning those martial arts from Japan and Okinawa. Now then, I don't know about you, but I personally probably don't like the idea of a occupying army suddenly being like, now teach us your ancient heritage is not even a word. Teach us your ancient heritage martial art or die. So they didn't really have much of a choice. So what they taught was actually kind of kids karate. The soldiers that were taught kids karate were taught kids karate, so they brought that back to the States. That's why you even have such a concept as blocks separate from strikes. But one of my cousins-in-law will fiercely say there are no blocks in kata, and there really aren't, because blocks are just strikes. All blocks are strikes. So it just, what are you doing? Like, what is it for? I mean, this could be considered an upward block against an overhead strike. This can also be considered an upward strike against somebody who's doing an overhead strike, but you're striking right here at the elbow fulcrum and trying to snap their arm. Blocks are strikes, make no mistake. They're strikes. I mean, you could even call them defensive strikes if you so wish. Now then, so in the U.S., you have these karate forms, and and make no mistake, even in traditional karate and in Hawaiian Kempo, there are still forms. Now then, I bet that my personal take is that it's probably the point of them initially was to train the techniques and in a sort of flowing manner that kind of makes sense in a very specific situation. Now then, no one is ever going to do a form in a fight. You might do a thing from a form in a fight, you might do that strike in a fight, but you're not going to do that strike here, and then here in a fight like is in one of the forms that my studio teaches. It's one of the penons, I can't remember which. They're almost interchangeable as far as which number goes where. Because some places their penon shodan is there, is another place is penon nidon, and it all used to be one form, and it was daunting. So they had to split it into 5 parts just to calm it down. Even so, but you still got people. I mean, even there's probably going to be people in the comments who are going to say, "Greg, you're wrong. Forms are the best," or "Greg, you're wrong. Forms are the worst." And I'll let you guys go at each other there, and I'm just going to stand on the sidelines and eat popcorn, because frankly, that's going to be hilarious to me watching you guys bicker about it. Even so, my snarkiness aside, forms have their place. It's just not everywhere, I would say. But they do have their purpose. They're there to teach you that, like, in this situation you might do this, but you might not. One of my instructors, the guy who taught him some traditional stuff, he would ask, now my instructor would ask the guy, do I do this, then this, then this? And he said, yes, good. Because it would have worked. I mean, like that, those strikes would have done the job. They would have dealt with your opponent. Like, is it block, kick, chop, or is it block, chop, kick? Yes, good. That's what he would say. Because you still got it done. You still did the job. You still did what you were trying to do. I mean, even with like techniques, as they're sometimes called, with like self-defense techniques that might be like block, kick, chop. You might not do that whole technique. You might just block and kick, and the guy's just like, okay, this dude is not worth it. He just kicked me in the solar plexus. I'm gasping for air, so you don't even need to do that chop. I've actually thought about writing a character who has like an entire plan for this fight. Like, oh, I'm gonna do like 18 different moves, and it's gonna be great. And then the guy falls on, and then his opponent falls unconscious like halfway through, and he's like, oh man, I wasn't done with him. Oh, grumble, 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 and then he just grumbles off and like. Anyways, I digress. Make no mistake, you're not going to fight somebody with a form. Even in Kempo, there are a set of what's called fighting forms. Those are short 1, short 2, long 1, and long 2. Brilliant names, I know. They're called fighting forms because they're the closest thing that you're going to get to using a form in a fight, but you're still not going to use that form to fight somebody, because short 1 is all blocks, even though there's no blocks in kata. So I correct myself with the entirety of short 1 is defensive strikes, as far as I know it. It's just bam, bam, and what good. But anyways, there's no punches or kicks in short 1. So as much as you might still snap a guy's arm with that upward, you're still probably not going to rely solely on defensive strikes when you're fighting somebody. Fights don't really have plans. No plan really survives first contact with the enemy. You can plan all you want, but it all generally goes to hell as soon as the fighting actually starts. You might be like, all right, I'm going to kick this man in the solar plexus, and then I'm going to punch that man in the face. But then you might end up kicking a guy's leg out and kicking the other guy in the groin. I mean, generally you want to try to avoid having a whole plan, because fights really aren't scripted. Like, that really should come as an obvious statement, but still, like, the main reason you'd ever see a trained fighter getting beaten by an untrained fighter is because that trained fighter is trained to fight other trained fighters, or they're trained to use this technique against that strike when the other guy's willing to improvise even though he's untrained. Even so, sometimes you see people who would by all other means be a black belt get knocked out by this massive haymaker, because usually a lot of people who train to fight are training to fight with other people who are training to fight, so you end up fighting trained fighters. Then when somebody does the untrained strike, you're like, wait a minute, I did not train for this, and then blam, even though you could probably order a pizza by the time that fist hits you. Just like, we're not playing soccer here. We're not gonna wind up and kick me halfway across the football field. I mean, but even so, why even forms is the main question of this episode. And I would say, personally, why even forms? Because I almost want to say because your instructor told you to and you want that next belt promotion, but that's really not the whole story. I mean, make no mistake, there's definitely parts and forms I would never use in a self-defense situation. There are entire sequences, there are even entire just strikes and moves that I would just never use because that would be silly. unless a very specific situation came up, and that was the only thing that made sense at the time. Now then, one of the best things you can do alongside forms is a little thing called spontaneous self-defense, where basically somebody comes in with a strike and you just have to defend against it. Whether you defend against it with a technique or you come up with something new, and as long as the job gets done. It's called spontaneous self-defense, and I do recommend it for anybody who's practicing, that they do try to do that against a bunch of different strikes. I mean, you can have a general like go-to technique for or set of strikes for a particular attack. By all means, have like a general go-to thing, like for example, against that straight punch, I would like to deflect that, grab his arm, and then break it, and then smack him. By all means, have that, but do have something else too, just in case that suddenly doesn't work. That's why spontaneous self-defense is a great addendum to forms. It's like two different sides of a spectrum. It's like two opposite ends of a coin. Because forms are a very determined set of strikes and movements that combine together. Sometimes, I mean, some forms are really just for show, but not all of them. And then you've got on the other side of that spontaneous self-defense, where suddenly this guy's hitting you and you gotta do something. And if you don't do something, you're gonna get smacked, and being smacked is just no fun. And then you get embarrassed because like, oh, I should have beaten that guy. And then you end up having nightmares for the next 6 months about the opponent you cannot beat. And I am getting a little too real, because that's generally what I have. The nightmares of the opponent unbeatable. Foraying sort of into my nightmares of the opponent unbeatable, as I've called it. Some people like me, I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I used to be pretty physically weak. I mean, I was asthma stricken. I was criminally short. Like, you know that average growth chart thing that's like got like a little bunch of lines, and I didn't even register on that till I was in like middle school. And even then, I'm a little shorter than average, I would say. Like, I'm not quite of average height. But I would often have these nightmares of a shadowy figure, or like a defined person, that no matter where I punch or kick or stab or shoot, no matter what I do, I just can't hurt this guy. And it basically proves to me that I can't defend myself or people I care about. And I have been told before, like, make no mistake, Greg, you are physically capable of doing whatever you darn well need to a person. I mean, there is a video that I did take of me, and where I sidekicked through about 1.5 inches of pine, 2 pine boards stacked on top of each other with no spacer. So instead of 2 instances of 1 pine board, it's 1 instance of 2 pine boards, which does make a massive difference, by the way. And for my black belt test, I'm going to have to sidekick through 3 pine boards stacked on top of each other with no spacer. So it's basically about the equivalent of breaking through 3 ribs, because like about 3/4 inch of pine is equivalent to about a rib. And I've broken through 2 of those before with the sidekick. Despite all that evidence, sometimes I still have those nightmares because I do dwell on my failures a bit too much. But that's a little bit personal going into that, I realize now. I do believe that any one person can beat any other person given the right circumstances. For example, a person who is only maybe height tall up to here can physically beat a person who is 7 feet tall, because that would actually be not too terrifyingly difficult, because tall people like to use their range, and if you get inside that range, they're not going to know what to do unless they practice Wing Chun, which actually was the case once. It was kind of amusing because this guy was really tall and he knew how to fight up close, so that was like a nightmare to deal with. Even so, I do believe that any one being placed up against any other being, the two can beat each other. Like, if I put, say, my sister, who is like this very petite young woman who is just a little shorter than me and isn't very physically imposing, and you put her up against like somebody who's very well trained, very fit, physically she can beat that guy. Whether or not she will, that's another question entirely, but she does possess the physical capability to beat any one other being. It's just whether or not that actually happens. because there are parts of the body you cannot strengthen, like joints and muscles, like the groin muscle here, and these nerve clusters. I think there's one somewhere around here. Might have had that moved after my surgery. But man, what a journey this has been. It's gone from why even forms to the opponent unbeatable. And this kind of does go into that there is definitely a mental and psychological aspect to the martial arts. Toughening up the mind is just as important as toughening up the body, because, like many people have said, mental health is just as important, if not more so, than physical health, because if you can't function mentally, how in all the realms are you going to do so physically? But if I can tie this all right back up together to why even forms can give you, like, if you are capable of doing that form to a T, it might actually give you a bit of a confidence boost, and it might give you the know-how that you know that you are physically capable of defending yourself if you need to, as long as you are also training in more than just forms, that you're also doing that kind of spontaneous self-defense that I talked about earlier, where you just defend against that strike all of a sudden. Like, you don't plan that, because having a plan can actually be pretty damning, because if that plan doesn't go, you're going to freeze up and be like, wait, that didn't go according to plan. Wait, bad guy, hit me with a very specific strike because it's not going according to script. It's not going to happen. I mean, although I wonder what would happen if, like, in a fight I parried a guy's strike and was like, no, do that again, because I didn't quite do what I wanted to do, and it would probably distract him for a bit. He'd probably be like, what are you talking about? And just kick him or something. I don't recommend trying that, because I'm not going to be held responsible for someone else's tomfoolery. But forms probably could give you that little boost, if you do them exactly correct. If you do them so well that it impresses all the people and all the judges, if you're at a tournament or something, then it probably can give you like a confidence boost. But forms aren't necessarily combat, and combat isn't necessarily forms. I mean, it kind of goes back into all is one. I'm not doing philosophy until next month, I think. But even so, you've got forms, and usually you're just going to have to live with that. Whether or not you personally believe in them, forms are going to exist now unto the end of martial arts, which is pretty much not going to happen. As long as there are people, there will be martial arts. Whether or not those martial arts are effective will be determined by those people. And when it comes to all these concepts and such, you really got to take it as it comes. It's very much a matter of this is what it is right now, and you're going to have to deal with that. I mean, but I digress. Why even forms? I'd say that I've concluded at the very least that forms can give you a little confidence boost if you do them correctly. They can teach you that little thing right there. It might even teach you that you never want to use this particular strike at all because you don't really like it. And you'd rather know that you don't want to do that than not know that you won't want to do that, and then suddenly do that, and suddenly it doesn't work. It might teach you what not to do, even in a street situation, because you didn't like how that technique goes, and you're like, I'm just never going to use that. So that way, you just nix that out of your combat repertoire, as it were. And even so, even with the people who would say that forms are just the best thing since sliced bread, even with the people that would say that forms are absolutely useless and have no place in a good martial art, I mean, there's points on both ends of that spectrum. I mean, forms are always going to exist. There's no two ways about it. What martial art you do will determine what forms you do and whether or not you even do them, because if you do, say, jiu-jitsu, if you do Krav Maga, you're not going to do forms, because forms don't exist in either of those arts. But if you do something like karate or taekwondo or wushu, or even eskrima has like a form that's called solo form, and the eskrima solo form is very much just an overview of the basic strikes and parries, just to knock that into your head. And sometimes quite literally, as I've learned, when it comes to Eskrima, is getting stuff knocked into your head. But make sure it stays there, because if it gets knocked out of your head, it's no use to you then. But I digress. Forms are going to be there, and unless you're in a martial art that really does not do forms. I mean, and even as martial arts are defined as a military art, militaries will not teach you to do forms. They'll teach you how to fight, because that's what the purpose of a military is. It's to fight, whether in defense or offense. Their purpose is to fight, make no mistake. So you have stuff like the Marine Corps martial arts, MICMA. They're not going to teach you forms. Why ever would they? You're not going to fight with a form. Sistema does not use forms, because that's not what it's for. It's not for forms, it's for fighting. Even though a martial art is for fighting, there might be forms because it hasn't been used as the dominant fighting art. I'd be willing to bet that in the old days of Tay, and even in the old days of Wushu, like when it was first getting formed up, I bet there were not a lot of forms, because it was being used to fight, and you don't fight with forms. So it might be that globalization thing again that I mentioned previously, that it might be just there's a universal sort of recognition standard that says this guy knows what he's doing, and that might be forms. So one could even argue that forms really are just for show. Forms may just be for sport, but they will, because the only time you're ever going to do a full form in front of other people for the purpose of doing that form is probably in a tournament before judges. You're not going to fight with a form. I've said that so many times, and I'm going to say it again. I'm going to say it one more time to knock into your head. You're not going to fight with a form. But you're still going to learn it probably, especially if you're doing one of those traditional martial arts. Even historical European martial arts, really doesn't have forms, because it was a combat art, and I'll bet. And in the early days of Wushu, the forms were really just compilations of knowledge. Just like, this is what I know and what I've learned. This is not something that would be used in a fight in its specific circumstance, but this is just kind of a compilation of knowledge. So I mean, I guess you could call a form a compilation of knowledge, because that you show to other people that you might incorporate into your own system, because it's a compilation of knowledge. It's basically a sort of kind of TLDR version of all of your techniques and such, because you might have a technique that goes block, kick, chop, but your form might contain kick, block, chop, uppercut, and because it's a compilation of knowledge. You might have repeat stuff to emphasize how prominent that knowledge is in your system, but I don't think anybody learns forms because they feel like they're going to fight with them. At least no one who has half an ounce of self-respect is not going to say, learn these forms because you will use them in combat, because you don't. You don't use a form in combat. You use a form as a compilation of knowledge to maybe remind yourself this technique exists. This strike is a specific counter to that thing. So I guess in conclusion you could say that forms by their nature aren't useless, but they're not the best things in sliced bread. They're kind of like in that little happy medium there. Like, do them if you will, do them if you won't. I mean, do them if you will, don't do them if you won't. I mean, even if it is just because your instructor said so, forms have their place. They're there to stay because they're there to stay. And then I could go into all that sort of thing, but I'd only just end up repeating myself. But I guess the whole thing is, forms are forms. What a conclusion. Forms are forms. Thank you for watching this week's episode of Knowledge Drop with me, Greg Laurel. If you want to keep yourself updated on episodes and never miss one, do go ahead and click that subscribe button below. If you got suggestions, comments, or even questions for me regarding the show's topic, or just about me in general, go ahead and leave a comment. I'm probably watching. So until next week, May warrior and scholar come together and help each other to return home in great victory.